Good morning. This hearing on the subcommittee of the Western Hemisphere, transnational crime, civilian security, democracy, human rights, and global women's issues will come to order. I thank you for being here today. The title of this hearing is Cartels and the U.S. Heroin Epidemic, Combating Drug Violence and Public Health Crisis. Before we begin the meeting, on a matter of personal privilege, I wanted to acknowledge the contributions of a loyal and a dedicated staffer, because behind every one of us here in the Senate, there's loyal and really hardworking people. Literally, they sit behind us at these meetings, and they do all the hard work behind the scenes to make sure that we are briefed and prepared to cast votes and advance public policy that makes a difference. And since 2011, Maggie Doherty has been an instrumental part of our policy team, and she's logged in countless hours working on all sorts of complex and important issues for our office. She's also logged in countless hours sitting behind us here in these committee meetings, but no longer. Today is Maggie's last Senate Foreign Relations Committee meeting, and in a week's time she'll depart our office to even a bigger and better opportunity. So I just briefly wanted to thank her for everything she's done for us. We're very proud of her work. So the title of this hearing, The Cartels and U.S. Heroin Epidemic, we have two panels testifying. The first is an official panel that will feature Mr. Daniel Foote, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement at the U.S. Department of State, and Mr. Kemp Chester, the Associate Director for the National Heroin Coordinator Group for the Office of National Drug Control Policy. The second panel will present the Honorable Teresa Jacobs, the Mayor of Orange County, Florida, and Mr. Stephen Dudley, the Co-Director of Insight Crime. Thank you all for being here today. We appreciate your time. We appreciate your dedication. And I'd also like to thank all of those who worked alongside my staff in making this hearing possible. Drug cartels operate out of countries in the Western Hemisphere, and they do so by using sophisticated distribution systems that move narcotics into and across the United States. Heroin supplied by these cartels has created a public health epidemic and fueled drug violence across this country. The heroin epidemic, drug war, and fight against drug violence are unfortunately becoming part of everyday events in our society. It is our duty to find the best possible avenues and allocate resources to provide the best tools to equip those on the front lines to fight this public health crisis. We need to examine what the United States, Mexico, and other regional partners are doing to cooperatively address the rise in heroin and in drug trafficking. Promoting the efficacy and proper execution of U.S. initiatives to stop the spread of heroin and combat the drug cartels should be one of our top priorities. Here's some facts. One of the primary culprits in this fight is called fentanyl. It is a synthetic opiate that is 25 to 40 times more potent than heroin, and it may be used to treat pain associated with advanced cancer. While fentanyl is legally prescribed in the United States, the CDC states that most cases of fentanyl-related overdoses are associated with non-pharmaceutical fentanyl. It's a type used as a substitute for heroin or mixed with heroin or other drugs, sometimes without the user's knowledge. In 2015, the DEA's National Drug Threat Assessment Summary reported that Mexico and China have been cited as the primary source country, though some analogs of fentanyl are manufactured in China. These supplies are often trafficked into the United States, across the southwest border, or delivered through mail couriers. Transnational criminal organizations also use Florida as the point of arrival for South American cocaine and heroin. Much of the illegally diverted and produced fentanyl is found in the same U.S. markets where white powder heroin is found. According to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, the estimated number of individuals who used heroin was 914,000 people in 2014. In addition, there are about 586,000 individuals, or basically 0.2% of the 12 and older population, had a heroin disorder in 2014. While there's been an increase of heroin overdoses and heroin-related deaths across the United States, the Midwest and the Northeast regions have been areas of particular concern. To this day, the administration's efforts, despite the administration's efforts, heroin-related overdose deaths increased by 244% between 2007 and the year 2013. The U.S. has responded to such findings by launching the Heroin Response Strategy, leveraging upon the 15 high-intensity drug trafficking areas across the country. Mexico, our regional partner, has displayed willingness to cooperate with U.S. authorities. But despite these operations, the International Narcotics Control Strategy Report estimates that less than 2% of cocaine that comes through Mexico is seized by this country's authorities. Under the Mérida Initiative, Congress has provided billions in funds to the Mexican government to improve security and the rule of law And I applaud the continued efforts of the Mexican government to continue its drug crop eradication efforts and to arrest drug kingpins. However, we are still far from the finish line. I think the Congress can continue to work in constructive ways to promote legislation addressing opiate abuse. I'm proud to be the co-sponsor of the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, a bipartisan bill that overwhelmingly passed the Senate. I also applaud the House for working to address this issue, and I hope soon we will be able to send this legislation to the President's desk. It is my hope that today's hearing will shed light on the consequences that this epidemic will have in our society and future generations if left unaddressed and not given proper attention. I'm optimistic this hearing will serve as the opportunity to learn about the administration's priorities in combating the heroin epidemic and drug violence. And I hope you'll address these issues in your testimony as well. With that, I would now turn it over to our ranking member, Senator Boxer, for her opening statement. Thank you. Just a couple of points that I wanted to raise. First of all, why Lawrence, Massachusetts? Why New Hampshire? Why are these communities specifically targeted in Florida, for example, Central Florida? How does a community wind up targeted by these criminal gangs? What are the characteristics that are making them as opposed to some other part of the country?
Senator, there are a number of variables, one of which is the existing structure, the existing trafficker structure that's in place in particular areas. In some cases, it's transportation networks. In some cases, that the traffickers from Mexico have personal or business relationships with traffickers in a particular area, or that geographically a place lends itself to further distribution. There are a lot of reasons why particular...
But the Northeast is far from the U.S.-Mexico border. I mean, my question is, why didn't they stop somewhere along I-95 and target there? I mean, how'd they wind? Is it because of these existing structures that were there before?
We believe that there's very strong evidence that there are, that it's the existing structures that were there before. When we specifically talk about fentanyl, one of the things that we have looked at as we've tracked the fentanyl crisis is why the Northeast? Why the Eastern United States? Why so much not the Western United States? And we believe that one of the strong contributing factors is the fact that fentanyl is more easily mixed into the white powder heroin, which was preferred in the eastern part of the United States, than it is in the black tar heroin, which was preferred in the western part of the United States. And that's traditionally been the heroin market in the United States. And so fentanyl introduced is being mixed into powder heroin, and therefore it landed in the United States, and increasingly we're starting to see it be pressed into pill form and sold as counterfeit oxy or counterfeit opioids. But fentanyl has found a market in the eastern United States probably because of those two reasons.
Well, I spent some time in New Hampshire over the last year, and from that experience found myself in a lot of small townships, not large places throughout New England, that faced an overwhelming problem, almost as they were specifically targeted perhaps because trafficking networks knew that they had smaller police departments. You're a small township, you're not going to have a 1,000-officer department. Is there evidence that some of that is in play for these trafficking networks, that in essence they look to set up in places where they can overwhelm local law enforcement with numbers and capabilities?
Senator, I don't know. I don't know whether that was the size of a population or the size of law enforcement was a particular reason why. But to your point, it is a matter of deep concern that you find increasing numbers of heroin or fentanyl users in rural areas who are starting to use the product alone, and they're far from treatment, and they tend to be farther from first responders. Those are all things that make this particular crisis particularly pernicious, is the fact that it has moved into a lot of rural areas, which is not something that we've seen in previous outbreaks of heroin or opioids.
And I know what I'm asking, and perhaps it's more appropriate to the second panel, is more of a domestic issue as opposed to a transnational one, but some of the stuff we used to hear were increasingly, because the supply is also driving the demand, they're interrelated. In essence, the supply meant these traffickers who now had the supply on their hands had to be more aggressive in finding market share. And one of the things I kept hearing a lot were that they were specifically targeting treatment centers, especially outpatient treatment centers, where they knew people were getting treatment because of addiction, and they were waiting for them outside to tempt them to buy, that they specifically were targeting recovering individuals for the sale of this. And this is a pernicious, disgusting industry that we're dealing with here. And in that realm, I wanted to ask, since the arrest of El Chapo, Secretary Foote, You know, this is part of Mexico's, I believe, a concerted policy to conduct high-profile arrests of drug lords. And while it's positive that these organizations are being decapitated, have we seen any evidence that the arrest of a high-profile individual impacts the ability of these organizations to continue to function? Specifically, since El Chapo's arrest, is there any evidence that the operation has been impacted by it, or is it just one of those things that's now functioning the way a corporate entity would, irrespective of who's at the top?
Senator, while my personal experience is far more robust with Colombia, where I led our programs several years ago, we have seen where the kingpin being arrested does certainly affect an organization. The question is, how big is the structure, how organized is it, and how quickly can it recover? That's a question far better posed to our Drug Enforcement Administration guys than the state.
Let me ask you about Colombia. It's not directly related to the opiate issue, but nonetheless, cocaine. They suspended their aerial eradication program ostensibly for fear of the impact that the defoliants would have on the population environmentally. There is a counter-argument out there that some have made, in which I find some credibility in, that this is also part of the peace process, that in essence this deforestation effort was, and the eradication effort was an irritant in the peace process with the FARC and other elements. As a result, we now see numbers where, for the first time in a long time, there's been a massive increase in the amount of cocaine production in parts of Colombia that we hadn't seen in a while. And the assumption is that that cocaine is going to get sold. It's going to go somewhere, and that we should expect at some point within the next couple of years to see a spike in cocaine sales in the United States. Do you have a view, irrespective of the reason why they're doing it, do you have a view of what these new numbers mean for the U.S. in the years to come?
We are concerned about the suspension of aerial eradication. It is a sovereign decision of President Santos and the Colombian government, obviously. We believe while eradication and aerial eradication are not magic pills, they are valuable tools in any supply-side intervention on narcotics. It has long been a big part of our strategy in Colombia. We continue to work closely with the Colombians on the successor to Plan Colombia, which is Paz Colombia, Peace Colombia, and are in close contact to see which direction they decide to go if and when President Santos gets the peace process resolved.
And here's my final question for the panel, and I thank you both for being here and for your testimony and for your work. The work you do is important and difficult. We now have two separate but interrelated problems. As the senators just pointed out a moment ago, the production of synthetic fentanyl, the growth of opiate poppies. My understanding is that the amount of poppy-based opiates grown in the Western Hemisphere is a small percentage of the overall production in the world. In your view, or you know this, how much, if a poppy-based opiate is produced or fentanyl is produced somewhere in the Western Hemisphere, Mexico or anywhere else, what percentage of that is destined for the United States in particular?
Senator, we believe that Mexico is the primary supplier of heroin to the United States, and that the United States is the primary customer for Mexican heroin. That relationship in the Western Hemisphere is fairly solid. We do not see any evidence, any widespread evidence of Southwest Asian heroin, Afghan heroin, Burmese heroin coming to the United States, although the government of Canada does believe that Southwest Asia is its primary supplier of heroin. So one of the things that we've discovered as a risk, and we have identified as a risk, is if we are successful against the Mexican drug trafficking organizations in bringing down the supply of Mexican heroin in the United States, do we open up the door for others?
But I think it's pretty clear that if you see a heroin overdose in the U.S., that heroin or that fentanyl came from Mexico, or maybe in the case of fentanyl, China, through the mail. Okay, I think that's pretty clear. Here's my question. Is the opiates being grown or produced in the case of fentanyl in Mexico being sold anywhere else in the world, or should we basically assume that virtually all of it that's being grown there, you can see it from the camera pictures are being taken, all of that is headed to a city near you in the United States?
That is the assumption we make, Senator. Yes, that's correct.
Thank you both for being here. I want to begin with one of the questions I alluded to during the testimony, and that is I can't prove it, but I guess it's been anecdotal. We don't have a number behind this, but the notion that these criminal groups are specifically targeting people recovering, in essence, they basically station themselves outside of a rehabilitation outpatient center, even an inpatient center, knowing that these people are vulnerable, and enticing them to fall back into addiction. Have we seen, Mayor, have you seen evidence of this? Mr. Dudley, have you heard about this as a recurring issue, a specific practice at the local level of targeting people in recovery for sales?
I have not seen evidence of targeting our treatment facilities. I will say that it certainly appears on the surface that there has been a targeting effort towards which communities to infiltrate with heroin. And certainly I look to the increase in heroin coming into our communities, the increase of fentanyl at the same time that we were restricting access to prescription drugs, as suspecting that there's a strong correlation between those two and a causation between those as well. But I don't have direct evidence of it. It just seems hard to imagine that there wouldn't be a direct relationship between them.
Thank you, Senator. I also don't have direct evidence of this activity on a local level. I will say in Mexico that criminal groups have targeted recovery facilities, but more as recruitment centers, not necessarily
Recruitment centers
for them, for their own, to basically build out their own criminal operations.
You mean for like dealers?
Not for dealers, just for memberships. So, people who would participate in the criminal organization. So that has certainly happened, especially with regards to Familia Michoacana, a very famous group there. The upshot of this is to say whether or not they're targeting to pushing drugs in certain areas. I'm not sure is as relevant as the sort of whole picture, which is what the mayor alluded to, which is this idea that this is largely driven from former people who use pharmaceutical drugs, and those people you can find all over, and that accounts also for the sort of dispersed nature of this epidemic, as opposed to sort of the 1970s where you had it very concentrated in urban areas. Now we have it spread out throughout many different parts of the United States.
So I want to share with you an anecdote. This weekend I have a personal friend who's a police officer in Miami-Dade County, and he recounted a story that he pulled up to a car that was kind of pulled over on the side of the road, and there was a woman in the driver's seat. She was kind of slumped over, and it caught his curiosity, so he pulled over and knocked on the window. This was a nice car, by the way. Obviously, this is a person of financial means. Knocks on the window, and the person immediately pops to attention, and he can see that in her arm there was a needle. She was basically shooting up on the side of the road in a luxury vehicle. Knocks on the window, rolls down the door. Knocks on the window, she rolls down the window. They begin to interact. Obviously, he's has a decision to make about how to treat her. This is someone who said 10 years ago he would have arrested her and taken her in as a criminal using drugs in the street. Today, his perception has changed because he's had several interactions, including this interaction with a person who, by the way, is a member of the Florida Bar, is a successful, functional attorney whose husband apparently also has a problem. The fundamental challenge he faces, he doesn't want to take her to jail. He doesn't view her as a criminal. He views her as someone who has a disease and is in need of treatment to overcome it. And by the way, her gateway in heroin was the use of a pharmaceutical painkiller for a surgical procedure 6 or 7 years ago, which she lost access to the medicine, and this is what's happened. And so the concern that I have is twofold, and perhaps you can both opine on this. Number one, if today you are dependent upon an opiate substance, irrespective of how you got there, but let's say in the case of this person because of the use of a pharmaceutical that led to this point, there is still an extraordinary stigma associated with it, as if you're a bad person who's doing a really bad thing and needs to be punished for it. And second, even if that stigma were to change so that we can get more people into treatment, and accepting the fact that I am physically dependent on this substance, in many communities there is nowhere to take them. The only place you can take them potentially is to a jail where you hope their withdrawals are managed, but may not be. And in essence, there's nowhere for them to go. We have many places we just don't have the capacity to meet that reality, which leads to the third problem, and that is the number of people who end up in a jail cell for 15 days, go through withdrawal, do not realize they have lost their tolerance, even in that short period of time, and when they fall off the proverbial wagon, they go back to using the levels they were using before they went through withdrawal, and it kills them because they lost their tolerance for an opiate. So given that perspective, I'm sure there are hundreds, if not thousands, of cases like that. What are the impediments to getting someone who faces this now, who I don't think so, but could be watching C-SPAN at this very moment? Not very many people watch C-SPAN, but are watching this or are hearing us talk about this. What's out there today, or what is missing for someone who needs this treatment and just doesn't know what to do about it next? Because especially for the uninsured, there aren't very many options from my understanding.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I think that is a key part of addressing the demand side. Part of it is to educate people and help them make the right choices to avoid overuse of prescription drugs. But the other part is, how do we provide the resources to treat people that are addicted? And the treatment options are very limited. For the uninsured, as I pointed out, 26 beds for 2.4 million people. Our jail alone, 1 out of 4 jails in the region, we have on average 200 people that we're treating for withdrawal symptoms and offering them a treatment program when they leave. We need more treatment facilities. When you ask me the question, are traffickers, are dealers preying on people coming out of treatment centers? The reality is we don't have enough treatment centers to prey on.
You said in your testimony, and I don't want to interrupt, but you said in your testimony you believe that Florida was specifically targeted because they knew we had the pill mill problem, and once that was cut off, these folks were going to need.
Exactly. That's what I believe. I don't have empirical evidence. What I have is the evidence of the increase in the flow of heroin and the increases in deaths related to heroin in correlation to our cutting off the pill mills. Let me also say that while we were dispensing more oxycodone than the rest of the country combined out of Florida, most of that was leaving our state. And most of these pill mills, you could drive up and you could look in the parking lots. The parking lot would be full, and only a small percentage of those were local license plates. Yeah. So the cartels may have misjudged the appetite, but they, no question, have flooded us with very, very cheap drugs. And the number of youth that I have seen that are struggling with addiction and have turned the corner and have had the good fortune and the money to find treatment, the insured portion of that population, to see that there actually is life after heroin addiction is very encouraging. But what's very discouraging is that most people that are addicts have no idea there's life, and most people that are addicts have no opportunity to get to those treatment centers.
Just to fill in the gaps on those who may not fully be aware of the Florida pill mill problem, we had these facilities. You just basically pulled up and said, my neck hurts or my back hurts, and by routine they would give you a package of prescriptions. It wasn't just, by the way, Oxy. They also put some other stuff in there, and people knew this, and you would have busloads of people actually come in sometimes. It was a huge problem. The Florida legislature closed that loophole that was allowing this to happen. So just to be fair, we're not talking about the prescription, the Oxy prescriptions being driven by a doctor at his or her office. It was these specific facilities that drove it. Did you want to add something on the treatment part of it? Because I had one more question I know that Senator Kane has.
Just very quickly, I mean, this is obviously framed as a law enforcement debate, and certainly I was asked to talk about the criminal organizations. But as you rightly pointed out, this is a public health issue. I mean, at the heart of it, this is a pharmaceutically driven epidemic, and it's a public health issue. And that's really the difficulty in facing up to this, is that it isn't necessarily a strictly law enforcement. We're not talking about throwing people into jails. You know, we need to be talking about how to get them better treatment.
And my sense on the human side of it is, I don't believe anyone wakes up in the morning and says, today is the day I become a heroin addict or an opiate addict. This is not something somebody wants to happen. You just see growing evidence. People don't realize the power of this. There's no responsible way to use this. And its impact on everybody's a little different. We know some people are more sensitive or susceptible to addiction than others, but it basically restructures the brain's chemistry in a way a disease would, and it has to be treated as that. I look at these statistics, for example, in Florida, just as an example, Orlando has 83 heroin deaths in 2014. Significantly, I mean, other communities have large numbers. West Palm Beach at 51, Miami at 60, Sarasota at 55, but that number pops out at you as a place that's been specifically targeted. And then you see the rise in deaths and kind of the spike we've seen across the country in heroin and opiate deaths, where the takeoff point has been is the introduction of fentanyl, which, as we've already seen from testimony today, is an incredibly powerful and lethal substance, which in fact, from my understanding, is not prescribed outside of a hospital setting to begin with on the pharmaceutical side, and is now being laced into, and I want to go to Senator Kaine, so I wanted to leave with this thought. I read the other day a report where someone who was he's now a recovering addict, was asked about this and said, you know, when you hear that someone has died from an overdose that was sold by a particular dealer, it makes you want to buy from that particular dealer because you know what they're selling is the strong stuff. Now maybe that's just one interview, one line somebody said, but it just kind of tells you the point we've reached here, where it is a very difficult and debilitating condition that we have to trying to understand here. And I think one of the keys is to remove the stigma associated with it. And I think many of us would be very surprised at the number of people we interact with on a daily basis that at some level have a dependence problem, maybe not through street heroin, but of some sort as a result of what we've seen happen in this country. And hopefully we can make advances in pharmaceuticals so that we can draw the line and we'll be able to treat pain effectively in this country without putting people at risk. Senator Kaine.